Welcome to another disastrous episode of What Happened, a show where we right the wrongs of Father Time, who tries to gloss over embarrassing failures with the passing of the ages. That's not our style, though. Oh no. Here we focus a giant spotlight of shame on bumbling video game buffoonery. And when you think of bumbling, a state where you constantly shoot yourself in the foot, miss golden opportunities, make the wrong choices, and generally screw everything up, well, no story does that better than the one about Silicon Knights and Too Human. Like many episodes of What Happened, we have to look deeper into the past to understand why the hell things went down the way they did in the future. Bearing that in mind, we need to travel back to the romantic Baroque-like time period of 1996. Silicon Knights had just released the game that would spawn the entire universe of Kain, Raziel, and the realm of Nosgoth with the seminal entry Legacy of Kain: Blood Omen, where it was published by Crystal Dynamics of Gex fame for the original PlayStation. Things already get really bad really fast, as a dispute soon arose between Crystal D and Silicon K, both alleging that they controlled the IP and disagreed on what to do with it. Crystal eventually just pushed forward with their own sequel, cutting Silicon Knights out of the deal, even though the original Blood Omen had been a moneymaker. Not taking that lying down, Silicon Knights fired back and sued their one-time partner to try to block the release of the forthcoming sequel, Soul Reaver, claiming Crystal had stolen one of their unused storyline ideas. This is important because it's a great example of how salty these Silicon Knights can really get.
But I had no idea she was motivated by such petty revenge.
They eventually decided to settle out of court, and the publisher of Soul Reaver, Eidos Interactive, quickly bought up Crystal Dynamics, who went on to be the superstar studio we know today. Silicon Knights, however, moved on to a new concept, one that was about futuristic cybernetic deities, and it was called Too Human, and hoped to release it in 1999 on no less than 4 PlayStation compact discs. That, however, clearly never coalesced, which is something of a running theme with SK projects. They instead focused on their new IP, Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem, a title revolving around old gods and interstellar horror. But with both Eidos and Crystal D out of the picture, who would publish this mature-themed action-adventure? Why, Nintendo, of course! Both companies struck a deal, and they planned to release the darkness at the tail end of the N64's life cycle. This, however, was not meant to be, as Sanity's Requiem was cancelled for the aging hardware before being moved over to the GameCube, where it finally saw release in 2002. Nintendo certainly needed as many mature-rated games as it could grab for its purple lunchbox, and Eternal Darkness wound up selling fairly well and reviewing better with critics and fans. Things seemed to be looking up for Silicon Knights, as they even got to work on the legendary Metal Gear Solid franchise, a deal that was only possible due to their close association with Nintendo. The mouthpiece and founder of the St. Catharines-based developer, Dennis Dyack, is even quoted as saying in an interview with Nintendo World in 2003, "When you think about Silicon Knights and you think about Nintendo, if you're going to view us as a separate entity or as a traditional second party, you're probably going to be wrong on most accounts. We highly collaborate with EAD all the time. In many senses, we're inseparable. I like to consider us basically a team that's inside Nintendo. That's really it." Then, in 2004, less than a year after that interview, Silicon Knights announced they were separating from Nintendo, shacked up with Microsoft, announced a trilogy of Too Human games, released the first and only one to critical and commercial failure, and closed down a few years later. So what happened? Too Human had hitched a ride with a number of consoles throughout its long gestation period, first on the PlayStation, and then appeared in FMV form from the GameCube at Nintendo Space World in 2000. They always seemed to give the impression 2 Human would be epic and ambitious, and Silicon Knights were always pushing to use better and better technology to achieve the game's scope. When you looked at their output for Nintendo during these early aughts, however, you saw an N64 project upscaled to the GameCube, limiting how good it could look. You'd see a remake of Metal Gear Solid, a project they obviously lacked full control over. They were raring to launch into full development of their next game once their schedule was clear, and it was obvious they wanted that game to be 2 Human. Now, since they were inseparable and basically a team within Nintendo, SK got to see the early prototypes of their next console, the Wii, and with a late 2006 release date planned, it would be the hardware that 2 Human would run on. Silicon Knights, however, was not happy with this, as they wanted to work on the most cutting-edge machine they could get their hands on. Convinced Nintendo was making a huge mistake, they asked for their second-party status to be dissolved and quickly struck a new deal with Microsoft in early 2005. Around this time, a problem that most developers face when working at the dawn of HD gaming was being unprepared for the complexity and ballooning expense of building their own game engines. So, Silicon Knights chose the most popular and up-and-coming one available, Unreal 3. However, the early builds of 2 Human that were shown to the public in the years leading up to launch were not met with enthusiasm, citing unstable frame rates, texture load-in problems, and clunky gameplay. The title had been in development on and off for the better part of 10 years at that point, so people were expecting to be impressed, and it just wasn't happening. During this tumultuous time of development, Dennis Dyack became increasingly irritated at online critics, the trade show circuit, and 2 Human being under a constant microscope. So much so that in August of 2006, rumors started circulating that Silicon Knights was unhappy with Unreal 3 and was considering dumping it altogether. Dyack himself squashed these rumors, claiming they were completely false, despite the fact they were completely true.
This will be war.
Less than a year after the rumors first popped up, in July of 2007, Silicon Knights sued Epic Games over the tech they had provided in Unreal 3, citing the engine's unreliability and poor performance as the reason 2 Human was stuck with the stigma of negativity, namely the impressions of their previous E3 demos. They also claimed Epic held back documentation and tech from their licensees, so that their own games, like Gears of War, would look and perform better, thus sabotaging competing products. And one of the more outlandish details of the suit is that Silicon Knights demanded that Epic be forced to surrender all profits garnered by Gears of War as a result of all this nefarious misconduct. Epic, for their part, made a brief statement saying that they would fight these allegations as they were completely unfounded. Meanwhile, Dennis and crew had already apparently dumped Unreal and were rebuilding 2 Human from the ground up with their own tech. Whew, bad move.
It's a good day to die.
You always say that.
It always is.
The lawsuit dragged on, completely bypassing 2 Human's eventual release in 2008, which received, shall we say, tepid critical response. The game still didn't perform all that well technically. Lots of people disliked the control stick only combat, the game felt overly grindy and repetitive, and the story was a bit too stilted and flat to make up for it all. Dyack was right that the game already had a negative stink around it, and while a decent percentage of this had to do with those earlier demos, a decenter percentage had to do with his own conduct. His war with NeoGAF, the lawsuit itself, and lots of comments in several interviews where he was having a moan about various aspects of the gaming industry. These things didn't help, because ultimately 2 Human never managed to sell over 1 million copies, which is pretty dismal for a big budget Microsoft published title during the heyday of the 360. The only thing more dismal would be if Silicon Knights somehow failed in their lawsuit against Epic, which, they did. In January of 2014, 6 years after Two Human hit store shelves, a jury rejected all of the claims made by Silicon Knights, so the Ontario developer saw no compensation at all. But in the most stomp a guy in the balls while he's down moment ever, the jury found all of Epic's counterclaims against Silicon Knights were completely valid, and therefore had to pay Epic $4 million in damages, which was later hilariously increased to $9 million. The court found what was deemed as overwhelming evidence that was contrary to the original suit's claims, where SK alleged that they completely rebuilt Two Human from scratch in their own engine and that not a single line of Epic's code would remain in the finished game. As I'm sure you can all guess, it turns out lots and lots of Unreal code was still left in the game, and poorly hidden to boot. This infringed on Epic's copyright, so the court also mandated that all non-sold copies of Two Human should, nay, must, be destroyed. Not only that, it had to be deleted off the Xbox Live Marketplace as well, so now it no longer exists in the Digiverse either. All of this cost Silicon Knights dearly, but the company was already struggling long before that. This was just the good old death blow. They had numerous failed projects that never even got off the ground, with both Sega and Activision following the release of Two Human, with such names as The Crucible, The Box, and Siren in the Maelstrom. And the less said about X-Men Destiny, the better. Honestly, that's a whole other can of crap. But the history of failure at Silicon Knights doesn't stop there. We would be remiss to not mention the spectacular shit show that was Shadow of the Eternals. In a bid to recapture their glory days of 2002, Dennis Dyack, now having rebranded himself under a new company, Quantum Entanglement Entertainment, tried desperately to crowdfund a spiritual successor to Eternal Darkness in 2013, about a year before their lawsuit against Epic crumbled.
The world is a rough place, my dear. It couldn't hurt to have a little help.
The Kickstarter was vague, shady, and was asking for well over $1 million to fund just one episodic chapter in what was to be a line of games that would carry on the narrative. Unfortunately, with all the ill will Silicon Knights had garnered over the years, it was clear that the project wouldn't even come close to its price tag, and thus the campaign was cancelled well before the funding period even came to an end. Much like the old gods it took inspiration from, though, the project simply wouldn't die and relaunched on Kickstarter months later, providing more clarity and having dropped its cost to around $700K. This didn't help, oddly enough, as Shadow of the Eternals failed once more and missed this new goal by a good $300,000. While you'd think the game would be seemingly cancelled at that point, Mr. Dyack assured people 2 years later in 2016 that it was still being worked on with a very brief and basic teaser video, but has remained quiet about it ever since. Now, what about Epic Games? They're doing fine. As for Silicon Knights, well, the company officially ceased to be in 2014, and the rest of their financial assets were taken away in the lawsuit, and Mr. Dyack seemingly hunkered down in his new company, Quantum whatever the hell, and is pretty busy doing nothing. A good amount of research went into figuring out what his company does exactly, as its website mentions they had something to do with Pacific Rim and the Scott Pilgrim movie, but it's unclear what. They seem to now just be a weird YouTube channel that talks about the successes of yesterday, Eternal Darkness, Twin Snakes, and the like. We honestly can't figure out anything beyond that, as they've released no video game, television, or movie projects of their own during the entirety of their existence. Is it a front for the Canadian Mafia? Maybe. And with that, we say goodbye to the saga of Silicon Knights and Two Human. A project so disastrous, it literally unraveled time to destroy itself in the future and scrub its DNA off the internet forever. The moral of the story? You should have stuck with Nintendo. If you have a nose for failure and want to throw those stinky video game turds on our stage, suggest one in the comments below or send me a frank and cordial email to mattmcmuscles@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.